Spoiler alert, both your host and her guest wind up crying at some point during today's episode. If you would like to see that rather than hear it, head over to the YouTube channel for the video along with audio of this and all episodes of the Release podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the Release on YouTube, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. What is the correct way to define modern masculinity, and how can we teach our sons to get it right? Carlos Andrés Gómez is a Colombian American poet, speaker, actor, and author of the memoir Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood. From HBO's Deaf Poetry Jam to keynotes across 6 continents, Carlos is a unique voice in the world of masculinity and a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the MFA Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College. He's also a husband and a father of 2. On today's episode, we talk about why the phrase toxic masculinity is so triggering, what a single mom can do to guide her son towards healthy masculinity without overcorrecting, and how loneliness could be the root cause of most of humanity's problems. We dig deep on the Soho bar fight that changed Carlos's life, the tears he didn't know were so necessary, and how his message affects convicted prisoners so deeply. Acknowledging emotion was taboo for Carlos growing up, as it is for many boys, and he got the message. And the painful depth of that denial was crystal clear in a story he shares about carrying a 170-pound paraplegic man who was a virtual stranger up 4 flights of stairs in the absence of an elevator, which was nowhere near as difficult as acting like it was no big deal, regardless of how his arms were shaking, how his sweat was pouring, and whether he thought he would even make it. Because they both knew that real men could just never admit or even suggest that anyone else ever admit they could be vulnerable. Get out your Kleenex. You'll be so glad you did. Why do you think so many people are offended by the phrase toxic masculinity?
I think a lot of men are offended by the phrase because, what's the classic feminist maxim that for some reason is never attributed to anyone? When you're accustomed to privilege, equity feels like oppression.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think many of us have such little practice being critiqued, being challenged, being being called to those things that so many of us accept as just the cultural norm, and somebody is telling us or maybe suggesting that it might be very destructive the ways we've learned to be men. I think that's a really disorienting thing for a lot of men, and they don't really know who to be when that script is taken away. And I think out of that fear and insecurity, and out of that the fragility that has only been scaffolded over time because we have not been challenged because of patriarchy and sexism and the ways that so many things in the world are situated to privilege us and our experience and our bodies and our whims. I think men get very defensive when they hear that the idea of masculinity might be toxic or a version of it might be toxic. And, interestingly enough, in a lot of my work, I actually have stopped using toxic masculinity because so many men are so defensive and kind of literally or figuratively leave the room. So a lot of times now I'll say restrictive masculinity. I think so much, if I'm candid, I think so much of what I've learned about masculinity, it orbits predation in different ways. And so I don't know how that can be anything but toxic, And my memoir and a lot of the work that I've done is about me interrogating times when I've been at my absolute worst, where I've gotten a lot wrong, where I've been deeply, deeply flawed versions of myself. And so, yes, this is a very roundabout way of saying, I think that so much of what we've been socialized to learn about just living in our bodies and encountering emotions and thoughts and feelings I think have, again, only helped to support the fragility that so many of us men embody. And so that's a very long way of answering a great question.
When you talk about men being afraid of their fragility, it's basically the idea that somehow certain men have grown up to believe it's possible to deny that they are fragile, which is
Mm-hmm.
insane because we are
Totally.
all fragile, right? But if you assume that there is fragility in all of us and that we all knew that at birth, do you think that fear of acknowledging fragility for certain men is trained into us, or do you think it's more primal than that? Like, as in, if you cannot suppress your acknowledgement of your fragility, how can you go chase down the mastodon and feed the family?
Yeah. I mean, people have been and are going to debate the line of nature versus nurture forever, but we haven't been chasing down mastodons for tens of thousands of years. So I'm going to
Yeah.
say it's trained into us mostly, to be
Yeah.
honest with you. I'm the son of an anthropologist, so maybe that's full disclosure on my bias.
Mm.
But I mean, I think also just seeing this evidenced in so many ways. Um, you know, I think when I was growing up, all the language and all the narratives that framed how I socialized my ideas about masculinities, the things I internalized were all like, don't be soft, uh, don't be weak, you can't be delicate, don't be, all the things. And it was always, and it was always framed in that binary. Whatever
Yeah.
we associate to, disparage, dehumanize, devalue what is associated with a girl, women, femininity, etc., I need to be the opposite of that. And
Mm.
so it's like, teaching my kids about learning to apologize or to repair after you get something wrong. And I don't know how old your son or your son is, but it's like I have
Yeah.
a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and
I,
your 4-year-old doesn't really have impulse control yet. That's understandable. You know what I mean? But
right.
it's like one of those things where people feel like they're betraying their personhood if they just say they're sorry. And I think this is like one of those, just one example of many where I think of several men in my life that I've looked up to or admired that
Mm.
I've literally never heard say I'm sorry once in their life.
Mm.
And I think this is also tied to the fear of, as though we associate um, acknowledging that I can be, that I can be fallible, that I can be vulnerable, that I can be flawed. That's like, who am I if I acknowledge that? And so
Right.
I think, to me, it's like apologizing. It's like acknowledging that you need to rest, acknowledging that you're too sick to do something, acknowledging that you're injured. I grew up in a culture and
Or
a
that you need
time,
help.
or that
That
you
you
need help.
simply need help.
100% that you simply need help. I mean, I have a whole chapter about it in my you know memoir about this. I was chronically ill my entire adolescence, basically. I was chronically ill from 13 years old to like 17 or 18 until we figured it out. And they thought I was terminally ill. They thought I lost all this weight. I was very, very sick. And my idea throughout all of that was basically like, I'm going to be a straight A student. I'm going to be all state in basketball. I'm going to go to the NBA. I'm going to achieve more. And I think, yeah, again, this is tied to masculinity and capitalism and so many things.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, a confluence of things that are all tied to patriarchy in different ways. But yeah, I absolutely think, again, a very long answer to a great question. You're asking wonderful questions. Is I think there's so much pressure taken off when men can know that it is normal for a human being to feel things, because all of us are emotional beings. I do events all the time, thousands of events with men, with boys, with folks that are incarcerated, with
Mm.
young people of all backgrounds, young people in juvenile detention centers, et cetera, et cetera. And I worked on Rikers Island in New York City when I lived there for more than 10 years. And when people see a man who is showing emotion without apology, and radiating that he's not doesn't feel shame around being an embodied emotional person, it's extremely jarring. But you also watch a process where you're not wiping it away. You're not saying I'm sorry. You're not embarrassed. And then suddenly everyone's looking at each other, because so much of masculinity is this panopticon where we're looking at each other like, wait, is he
Right.
okay with it? Is he
Right.
okay with this?
Is this
So am I?
acceptable?
Like, there are always guys who are like, Carlos, like, are you gay? That was a question I used to get so much.
Right.
Like, people
Right.
like didn't know what to do with like they needed a container to put it in.
So on that topic, tell
Yeah,
me
yeah.
about the bar fight that changed everything.
Like, yes. Yeah.
And
So
then I'll
this
tell you
is.
about mine. No, kidding.
Oh, really? Okay. No. Yeah. I mean, and that's a perfect transition. I mean, this is a moment of profound revelation. Usually somebody is, you know, meditating or praying, or, they're on a windswept mountain in Nepal. But for
Not
me, it was
you.
not me. No, not me. Not me. It was a few minutes after 3 in the morning at a nightclub in Soho in Manhattan. anybody who's ever been, I mean, I haven't been out clubbing in so long. I've been married for a long time at this point, and I have two kids. So, I hope you do, Poonam, but I haven't been to like a real proper nightclub in a while. But
I
back in
haven't
the
been in
day,
about 15 years, but
yeah,
thank you
yeah,
for
yeah,
thinking that that's closer to my
yeah,
recent
yeah.
life
No,
because
no, no,
that means
yeah.
that this is the right amount of spackle for the podcast. So
No, so
good
so it's a
feedback for my toxic
probably
femininity.
so probably similar for both of us then. Where are you again, Poonam?
I'm in Hudson Yards, but I grew up in New York and
Okay,
I
exactly. I
spent
thought
like
you were.
10 years as a
Yeah.
club kid,
Okay.
so I was
Yeah,
probably
of
there.
course.
What club was it?
Flow nightclub, actually.
I
Flow.
might
You remember this era. So anyway, as anybody who's ever been to a New York nightclub knows, in that era, again, don't know if this is still persisting. It's like, they pack, 4 or 5 thousand people in this club. They've got three little doors in the back that you're all supposed to, diplomatically, exit out of at 3:07 in the morning when they turn the lights on.
Mhm.
So you're wandering out. You can barely see your feet. And basically, I go to step on a spot that I think is available as we're about to go through the doorway, and I step on this guy's foot. How many stories start like this? And we both kind of stumble, and let's be clear, there definitely had been a few drinks involved.
Mhm.
We both kind of stumble. I start to put my hand up to kind of apologize, and he pushes me really hard. He takes his
Right.
shirt off, and
As one does.
as one does. You know how this goes. You're a club kid.
That's how my bar fight started too. But yeah, anyway, I took my shirt off. No, that ended the fight. It's a different kind of a story. Anyway,
Different
sorry,
kind
I'll
of a story.
stop. I'll stop. Yeah.
And so he's like, he's like, "What's up?" You know what I
And
mean?
that's
And
how I met my ex-husband. No,
yeah,
I
oh,
know.
yeah,
I'll stop. I'll stop.
and then you were
I'll
together for
stop.
15 years now. And then so this, anybody who's, unfortunately, people in New York know this all too well. I always envy people who I hear this script or this ritual, and they're just like really so interested in it. They're like, wow, I never knew this happened. But
Yeah.
people in New York know this is kind of the script. And so the circle opens up, my two friends kind of drop in next to me, and they're like, okay, are we doing this? I guess we're doing
Mhm.
this, right? His like seven friends drop in behind him. So it's not good math here. And, you know, I always say that the body is the source of the greatest and the least wisdom that we are capable of. And the story encapsulates both, and it epitomizes both. So first, it's the least wisdom. It's like when your body does something, whether or not you realize that it's been so deeply trained into it that
Mhm.
your body is making decisions before your mind seems to have any ability to intervene. So I take a hard step forward. The guy takes a hard step forward. Our like faces are almost touching. You know, we're just like staring each other in the eyes. It's like that really tense, you know,
Mhm.
deeply homoerotic moment. You know what I mean? Where like you're like, are people going to fight to the death, or are they going to
Are they
like?
just gonna make out? Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
just gonna make out? You know what I'm saying? And anybody who's seen like a proper, like a real New York fight knows like I mean I've seen like it's frequent like if somebody has a good friend they'll bring over a tub of Vaseline, a guy will take a handful out and start putting it all over his face. You know what I mean? But like reaching for Vaseline when you've taken most of your clothes off, like you're like this could go so many directions and a fight may not be in the top 100. But anyway, so we're nose to nose and we're like and anybody who see this moment knows like there's a point of no return. There's an invisible line
Right.
that nobody knows where
And
the
then it's
invisible
on.
line is until
No.
everyone knows where the invisible line is. And I lean forward, and this is, again, to be clear, no conscious thought has passed through
Right.
my head. This is all just, automatic, visceral, whatever is apprehended in the body and has been metabolized very quickly. I'm just reacting.
Hmm.
And I lean forward and I blink and I feel something down my face and I realize it's tears down my face. And to be clear though, like I wasn't like cowering. It was like me menacingly, and I blinked, and then like all these tears go down my face. And the guy like jumps backwards, and everyone was like, "What the?" And like everyone was like freaked out, like, and it was so bizarre because it immediately like completely, what's the word? It diffused. It was like me rolling a grenade into the space, but
Yeah.
having the opposite effect. I say like literally me those tears appearing very much against not like as a device or as a choice um, was like it was like a bomb blowing up in terms of everything we thought we knew about each other. And people didn't make fun of me, people didn't laugh, people were like confused, and people were disoriented. We tumbled down the stairs. My friend's like what are you doing? We're about to die. Like what's
Yeah.
happening? You know what I mean? And it was one of these things where it became kind of this like silly story or this like kind of like weird, like almost like magical realist story where it was like I could dictate the events that happened,
Mm.
but I had no idea what took place. But it's that my body, I think, at a time in my life where I actually thought in my conscious mind that I was deeply evolved, like outgrown all my baggage, but actually I had all this learning still in my body, which I know is still in there, of this kid who grew up in a very violent machismo culture and is like ready to fight at all times. And I think that I was like ready to fight to the death over nothing. And I feel like the story I
Exactly.
tell myself is that my body was grieving what still lived inside of me that I had not excavated. And that's where those tears came from. And that's what actually saved the life of all of us that were there. I mean, that could have been the last moment of my life or the
Ready
last
to
moment of that
fight
guy's
to the
life.
death over nothing.
Yes.
That's,
Yes.
which is sort of the male, unfortunately, often human condition. Part of what that made me think was when I was 22, I decided to travel around the world for a year. And that was not a
Wow.
thing people did at the time. But
Wow.
in any case, one of my best guy friends says to me, just promise me one thing. If you're ever in an unsafe environment, just act crazy. So that
Wow.
might have been a survival tactic in you.
No.
What do you think it was about that moment that triggered it?
I think I had enough experience in moments like that where, I mean, there really wasn't an out there, I don't think.
Yeah, there
Like there's
was
not a
no
way
way
to
out.
there's not a way to say, oh cool, I took a hard step forward, our noses are almost touching. Now actually
But
time
time
out,
out,
hold
time
on.
out.
Yeah, hold
Right.
on. Like it's like no, that's not an option. Like to be honest, like there's no resolution to that story
Mm.
without people fighting.
So it sounds like being backed into a corner, right? And being a
Yeah.
boy, I think in this world has a lot to do with being backed into a corner, modern masculinity, all the confusion. When I'm thinking about that fight, it kind of leads me to something philosophical as well, which is,
Yeah.
do you think toxic masculinity is driven more by fear of rejection or the loneliness of thinking nobody's ever going to understand you? When I say that, I
Wow.
mean
Interesting.
like
Yeah.
the loneliness, right? Men don't have anyone to talk to. I think that's 90% of the problem, like on
Uh-huh.
earth, right? Is
Uh-huh.
men not having someone to talk to who they really can be completely
One
vulnerable with. I think that's all that there
100%.
is, frankly. So there's that fear of being rejected or being told that you're not enough or being told that you failed at providing or being strong enough or protecting. But
Yeah.
then there's the other side of it that is really, I think it's such a core loneliness
Mm-hmm.
in men these days. I can feel it. There's a loneliness they don't quite know how to even admit.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about the next generation,
Ooh.
I'm trying to nip the
Wow.
toxic masculinity in the bud. Most of what I say, he's not going to hear, right?
Yes.
But where do you think it comes from? Is it about the fear or the loneliness?
I think they're connected.
Can't
I
you just
think
give
I
me an
think
answer? Can you just give me like some steps, a guidebook, what to do with my son?
well,
No?
I think the fear is a catalyst for the loneliness, you know? There's a and some people have written or talked about this. There's a loneliness epidemic that overwhelmingly impacts men, and it's
Yeah.
tied to all of this. I mean, you look at suicide rates. I mean, what is it? I think 6 times men compared to women. I mean, toxic masculinity is literally like killing men. I mean, you look at the great film that Jennifer Siebel Newsom did. That a bunch of friends in this, the mask you live in. They talk about this phenomenon that's been widely studied. Boys have really, really rich friendships growing up, overwhelmingly across the board, and so many boys are very emotional, very filled with life, and filled with emotional life. And I see this with my 6 year old son, and this phenomenon happens across so many cultural norms when they enter middle school, puberty, everything else, is all those rich friendships they have with other boys, they evaporate. And do you know when they get those strong relationships back? Do you know when they get those strong relationships back with other boys or men?
When they're
Generally
widowed?
speaking,
I don't, I don't know.
never,
Oh,
never,
never.
never. And I think that tells you so much about. I know it's like intense and that's heavy, but I think it's something that I say in every room. And I say that with my son. It's like I normalize having rich, healthy, nurtured friendships with people of all genders.
Yeah, but
but knowing
particularly boys with boys.
but
Right.
particularly knowing it's okay to have really rich, intimate friendships, relationships of all kinds, but like friendships with boys. And so, this is, I guess, the answer I was going to say. You asked the big question. I'm going to say the answer, and it's not an answer. Be weary of people who have answers. Just a suggestion. Just a suggestion. I know for me, modeling and sort of Socratically engaging and interrupting things that I think are destructive or not healthy is kind of like my way, my means of navigating so much of this. It's like so much of what kids do. I know you're a woman, you're not a man, but I think nurturing and giving permission to the things that maybe society and cultural frameworks are going to be less supportive of. I think you can be, there's tons of research around this too. Having one person, if it's your mom or your aunt or your, coach who says it's okay to show emotion. And then also it's like the modeling, you know what I mean? Like it's on all of us as adults and parents and mentors and whatever to say, like when we hear things, I challenge things all the time. You know what I'm saying? When you hear someone like, doing like the hyper romanticizing or sexualizing or whatever it is of like relationships of any kind, I'm always complicating. I'm always interrupting. You know what I'm saying?
I
I'm
like
like,
the word Socratic. I never really think of that as the backdrop of how I might speak to my son about masculinity, because I think that there's a natural instinct for any boy to reject whatever his mother says, and that's fine, right?
yes,
But
yes.
if you are
Or
Socratic,
whatever any
especially
parent
in
says.
different, or whatever your parent says, but in my case, I'm
Yeah,
I'm the
sure,
mom, so
sure.
you know, eh, and it is. I think it's a powerful way to look at it. But how do you strike that balance? How would you
Yeah.
recommend that a woman do that and provide all the nurturing without providing a situation where there's almost um, a rejection
Hmm.
of traditional, truly confident and grounded and beautiful masculinity?
Tell me about those elements or those qualities of traditional masculinity that you want your son to feel permission to embody.
So I grew
Uh-huh.
up in a home where my father's the kind of person who just simply takes pride in taking care. That's
Yes.
really all it is. It makes him more of a man that
Uh-huh.
his wife and two daughters have never felt anything other than supported emotionally, supported, right? Without being perfect and without being a maniac, right? But
Totally.
also being quite traditionally masculine in the sense that he can walk into a room and people will feel his energy.
And what I'm hearing is, and you feel free to correct me, obviously, if I'm mischaracterizing this, you know, you want your son to be confident, you want him to be accountable, you want him to be reliable, you want him to be nurturing, you want him to be an anchor. And I guess what I would say is that solely a thing that men can embody or that is unique to masculinity? And I think sometimes we're asking the wrong question or we're kind of overthinking it. Like, listen, I talk to boys all the time who like love Andrew Tate. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And if you're 13 years old and you're starting to figure out your own opinions and what sense the world makes, and every algorithm on the iPhone you just got 4 months ago are sending you Andrew Tate videos because he smokes cigars and drives a Ferrari, and you see like two scantily clad women next to him in slow motion and like this well scored 45-second reel, and you're like, that looks confident, that
Mhm.
looks like an anchor, that looks like everything.
Right, right.
But because you're 13, you don't have the context in
Right.
so many ways. You don't have the resource of knowledge. You don't have the experience. You're not able to build a nuance of saying, oh no, Andrew Tate is like, I mean, allegedly, I'll say that, you know, someone alleged to be like you know, have done some really awful things.
Right.
And so I think, it's, and in my estimation, like the absolute, one of the worst examples of masculinity anybody could want to emulate. And I think there's tons of these examples that are propped up by algorithms on social media. And so I think to me, like, and I know that, I always think approaching with curiosity is a great thing to do when someone says, why is there a girls' day? Why isn't there a boys' day?
Right.
I don't know. That's a great question.
It's a great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, why do you think that is? And this is, conversations we have all the time with my kids. Ask my kids, like, do you know what year women were allowed to have a bank account by
Yeah.
themselves? You know, do you
It
know,
blows
like,
their mind.
why? Yeah, it's like, gosh, why are men always expected to pay? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. You know, when, within all of your grandparents' lifetime, women were not allowed to have bank accounts.
Yeah.
Literally, were not allowed to have bank accounts. So why some of these things evolved were actually symptoms of something that was happening that was so archaic and so unfair and so dehumanizing. But if you're 13, you don't know this. You know what
Right.
I'm saying? And so but I think it's always interesting to let them discover it and move through it in different ways. I'm sure you do this already as a parent, but it's just like, I think for me, I'm always like, rather than like challenging my kid, I'm always like, yeah, that's a great, let's wonder about that together
Love
and
that.
let's
I,
explore.
I'm not that deliberate about using the Socratic method, so thank you, because I actually will go back to that, and I don't know why I don't think of it that way in my mind. Having a daughter and having a son, I've
Uh-huh.
seen that my children have very traditionally somewhat gendered personalities, if you want to put it that way. I
Uh-huh.
didn't start out with that assumption. I kind of
Yeah.
watched them. When you talk about Andrew Tate and you talk about all this stuff, my strategy around social media is no social media,
Mm-hmm.
and no cell phones
Yeah.
and no nothing until you're about 47. But there is this message that I know he's going to get, even if it's not from social media and if it's not from anywhere else, which is the idea that in order to be worthy, one must be useful as a
Mm-hmm.
man. There's something
Yep.
to that Andrew Tate concept, right?
Yeah. What you can provide.
How early on do you think boys are getting the message that in order to be worthy, you must be useful?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's ubiquitous. I think it's everywhere. I think you learn it constantly. I think it's literally, you know, a 3-year-old boy trying to slap someone's hand harder than someone else, or, ooh, that's a strong handshake.
Mm.
It's literally there. You know what I mean? I think it's
Yeah.
literally starting there. But it's not just being capable and it's not just being useful. It's about winning. You know what I mean? It's about conquering something. It's about
Conquering. Hmm.
it's about conquering something. You know what I mean? And to me it's like, it's like it's like cute and funny until you like think a little more profound about it, or maybe not. Yeah, and I think there, especially when men get together, there's so much about masculinity, like all gender in different, and well, many identities are to different extents, but particularly gender is so performed, and
Mm.
especially men. It's one of these things, just watching, and it's something that's fascinated me forever, and also made me really uncomfortable. Like as of now, I'm a cisgender, thus far, straight man, and that may change someday, but I've always been pretty unsettled around cis straight men,
Yeah.
just because of that kind of intensity and toxicity of the ways we need to perform,
And the
um,
need to constantly perform,
and
right?
reinforce. Right? I just think around like cis straight men, especially, it's just such a there's something fraught that always feels bubbling underneath, that we're all restless about.
So,
Yeah,
so when we
yeah.
think about notions of protection, um, performative protection, performative violence, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or the potential for violence. I know that you do keynote speaking all over the world, but you have this
Mm-hmm.
benefit of doing it at schools as well as at prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very different environments.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a fair bit of public speaking myself, and I know that based on the audience, you're going to get different reactions. How
Mm-hmm.
does the feedback on your comments on masculinity vary between prisoners and students?
The most generous audience I've ever been in front of in my life was at a maximum security prison, performing for a room full of men doing life sentences without the possibility of parole. And anybody who's ever, I think, spent time in an atmosphere with like lifers, I think they're often, in my experience, some of the most grounded, spiritual, I mean, absolutely widely read people I've ever encountered. So I would just say this, generally, when I've worked with people that are incarcerated, I think generally what I find is when I'm talking about men and boys, so many are so starved for this conversation. And I think
Mm.
often the people that would be stereotyped as being least receptive to this. They're these mind blowing revelations, breakthroughs, and so there's like a farmer with a "Make America Great Again" hat in Nebraska who gets dragged along by his son to a show in Lincoln, Nebraska, making some kind of questionable homophobic comments before the show, and clearly doesn't want to be there. And then he gets up to speak in the Q&A, and he's talking about his son, and he breaks into like tears, and like I know that what was built in the hour before that opened the door for him to do that, something that I feel pretty certain, and his son told me afterwards, I've never seen him cry, like, so
Yeah.
it's like opened the door for him to embody something that he's never done before, and maybe not, definitely not publicly. And so, I think generally, I do stuff with fraternities, I do stuff with student athletes, and I've had some incredible moments. And knowing the psychology that a lot of men are wrestling with, a lot of times men are giggling or laughing or standing up or trying to leave the room because they just they can't sit in their bodies and listen to what I'm saying. And there's such a powerful opportunity there. And to me, it's like, how can we, I feel like so much of my life is, how do I convince them not to leave the room physically? Because they always can, obviously. How do I subversively create an atmosphere where they're willing to endure the discomfort that I've created inside of them, that may be something they've never experienced in their life in this body, and then get them to consider moving deeper into it. And yeah, I guess that's a roundabout way of answering your question. I think oftentimes the men who have never encountered the things we're talking about are most starved for it, and they don't even realize it until it's happening. And I think, particularly dealing with people that are incarcerated, and they're so accustomed to systems failing them and being dehumanized and being thought of as a monster, that I think having a person, and whether I'm dealing with people doing life sentences or at Rikers, what I would always do is I walk up to every person in the room, even though there are 250 people there, and I'd walk up and say, "Hey, I'm Carlos. What's your name?" And I put my hand out, and I'll
Mm.
look them in the eye and I'll say their name. Like, "Hey, Nick, I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much." I remember I had a guy at a show at Rikers. One of the first ones I went, it was like 300 people in the gymnasium right before Christmas. This guy came up to me afterward. He said, "I don't think I've ever had someone shake my hand and say my name back to me in my life."
Mm.
It was this like 25-year-old guy.
I
And I was
did.
like,
You know what?
you know,
Just on the topic of prison, I did a
yeah.
podcast with Pete Early, who wrote a book called No Human Contact.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He is the Washington Post journalist who has the distinction of being the only person ever to have personal contact with the most isolated prisoner in U.S.
Wow.
history, terrible Tom
Wow.
Silverstein, leader of the Aryan
Wow.
Brotherhood. There is
Wow.
no excuse for any of the horrors that Tom Silverstein visited
Of
upon
course.
people.
Of course.
But the reason why Pete wrote this book was because he got to know him, really, really got to know him. They wrote letters together for years. He
Wow.
says, Tom was basically like my divorce counselor in the process of my divorce. I mean, they
Wow.
became friends.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
And my question for Pete was, knowing what you know about prisons and about no human contact and having had rare access to all of that, do you believe it is solely our relationships with each other that make us human?
Mm.
Because this guy had the
Whew.
longest period of time in what no
Wow.
longer exists, which is no TV, no reading, no writing, no COs to talk to him.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
So there's a whole other thing about masculinity and men who end up in prison, who generally are boys when they went to prison. So they've
Uh-huh.
never known a system that supported them,
Uh-huh.
right? I think that's not toxic masculinity. I think
No.
that's just a lifetime of swallowing and spitting pain. Like, I don't think that that's
Yeah.
about masculinity even.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I think it's the systems of our country and our world working as they were designed to work,
Yeah.
which is perform state-sanctioned violence against the marginalized populations that the systems and structures were designed to perform state-sanctioned violence against. And that's Black and brown people, poor people, women and gender minorities, immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But it almost doesn't surprise me that you're
Yeah.
saying incarcerated populations are very easy to trigger openness to your
Mhm.
message. Because if you spent your whole life, and the majority of these people do, if you spent your whole life going in and out of systems that do not serve you, that actually push you further away from your humanity or any access to the
Uh-huh.
possibility of a peaceful life, then as a man, I don't think you've ever even heard it was okay to be sensitive once. So if it's the first time anybody said that to you, you would be like a puppy who's been kicked every day of their life being given a cookie. That would be it. You would be done. So of course they're going to burst into
Yeah.
tears. Whereas men who are living
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
everyday normal life are
Yes.
being messaged
100%.
differently. And there's this covert
100%.
message constantly that, no, no, you're fine. You have warmth. You have people. You have whatever. So
Totally.
man up,
Totally.
right? To
100.
use your
100%.
phrase. So they almost
100%.
can't tap into it because there's so many layers of, no, you're fine. Don't complain. You're fine. You're fine. You're fine. It's not like you're a guy in prison. You got nothing to complain about, right?
100%. Yeah.
And there's a story.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
There's a 17-year-old YouTube clip
Yeah.
of your one man show. There's
Uh-huh.
a 10-minute piece, and it was called Man Up. And the clip was entitled Letting Us Be Men.
Is that the Julio clip with me carrying
When
Julio
you
up the
carry
up
him
the
up,
stairs? Uh-huh. And that's a
I
true
want to
story.
know if it's a true
True story.
story. And can
It
you
is.
summarize what happened? Because I
Yeah.
cried.
Yeah, it's a true story. And it's interesting because there was a play I co-conceived with Tamala Woodard, who's brilliant and chairs the Yale theater program now and is a dear friend, and she directed it and we took it to a bunch of festivals. So that story basically is uh, I worked at a camp in Providence, Rhode Island, where my mom still lives. This is in the early 2000s, and it was a camp for kids affected by HIV and AIDS. Many of them were HIV positive. Some had parents that were HIV positive, though they were not HIV positive. But many of them were orphans as a result of their parents dying away from complications from AIDS. And one of the kids had forgotten or I mean, it's not his. He was like a little kid. His mother had not dropped off his HIV medication, which is obviously very important. But
Mm.
I'm one of the counselors. I'm like, shoot, he was like one of my kids,
How old is
and
he?
he was 5, if I'm
5-year-old
remembering
boy
correctly.
doesn't have his.
So obviously he stays at camp, and I'm like, shoot, I gotta go get them. So I go to drop. We get there as the sun's going down, and the story was his older brother. Um, uh, they had been struggling with remaining housed. They were trying to get Section 8 housing, and we were waiting for it to clear, and blah blah blah. They were living in this apartment complex that their mom was very concerned about safety. Her partner, these boys' dad, had passed away as a result of complications with AIDS, and she was HIV positive. And the eldest brother, I believe he was like 17 or 18, who had been told he was the man of the house after his father died. He goes to the door to try to intercept people who are trying to break into their apartment. He confronts the people. He gets shot several times, and he gets paralyzed. He survives, but he's paralyzed from the waist down, so he's paraplegic. And so I pull up to the house, and it's this, it's like multi-level, one of these like walk-ups that are like the least accessible things possible. These steep,
Yeah.
no elevator, of course. And I walk over, and I notice that he's in the car with the door open, and I'm kind of like, and the guy who I'm going to call Julio, I'm like, Julio, like, he's like, your mom here? He's like, oh yeah, like, she's not here yet, but I'm just kind of like hanging out, wait for her to come back, blah blah. And then I realize that he's waiting because he needed somebody to carry him up to his room, and he lived on the top floor. Because there was no elevator, he had a friend who would sometimes do it, and there were some guys in the neighborhood, but like there was nobody there that was strong enough to carry him up the stairs
To his own bedroom.
to his own bedroom, right? And there's no other way to do it. And this is like literally, it's such a vulnerable thing. It's like 17, 18-year-old Puerto Rican kid, and so and he wasn't a big guy, but he's probably like 160 pounds, which isn't a ridiculous amount of weight, but like carrying that in your arms like this, like you got to be pretty
I couldn't carry
sturdy.
it.
Yeah, I know.
I
And I
mean,
was, I was in pretty good shape, so like I thought I could carry him. Like I thought I could do it, but again, it's like not nothing. And so I realized that he had wet himself, which is also like obviously not his fault. And I think he was really embarrassed about that. So he had like a towel over him, and he's kind of like, and he's performing all these things that are so familiar to me in the way I think about masculinity. And it's this whole negotiation of us kind of like downplaying this moment. Gotta be like emotional about it, my God. Like
Yeah.
downplaying this moment of him not feeling emasculated by me carrying up to his room, and how vulnerable it was for both of us, because I can't let him feel like this is difficult, because I feel like that's going to emasculate him or embarrass him
Yeah.
and make him feel like he's not a man. And so I'm carrying this 160-pound guy up 4 flights of stairs, up the stairs in front of his house, trying to do it quickly and efficiently so he doesn't look like a baby or a child. Um, and having us both just kind of like keep it as low key and casual as possible, so both of us can retain something that is both familiar to us. And so I'm carrying him up the stairs, and we're just like, he's just like, like literally like a guy at the bar, just like talking junk to another guy as I'm,
Talking nonsense. Yep.
and then we get to the third floor, and my arms are just like shaking so hard because I'm also trying to do it very like casually, which makes it actually harder. Like there are ways I could have like slung him over me that actually would have been easier, but I'm carrying him like he's just like a bag of like groceries,
Yeah.
because that's, I think, less emasculating. So we get to like halfway to the third floor, my arms are like shaking, and he like rests his head right here on my chest, and it was like nobody was watching, and he finally just like let go. And then like I finally put him down in his bed, and I noticed like his PlayStation or whatever. I'm joking around playing with him, and I glance over, and he's got tears in his eyes, and he says, "Gracias, hermano," and we like hugged. And I think like, so that story is a true story, and it was just something that will always stick with me.
I think it has been illuminating being a boy mom. Like I said, I think boys are aliens, all men type creatures, because I didn't grow up with a brother. But with every passing day, I hear stories like this. And what came through in that story for me was you are both trying so hard to hold on to something that doesn't matter.
100%,
And you're doing it for each
100%,
other and you're doing it for
100%,
society. And you didn't
100%,
even need to tell each other. You didn't need to
100%.
tell him, I'm not going to act like this is a big deal. I am going to make it so easy for you to say yes so that I can help you. I got you. I got you is a really important thing for a guy who considers himself a good man to be able to say. And
Yeah.
I don't know how heavy he is, but I'm going to just do it. And then it
Mm-hmm.
was really important for him to act like it was no big deal to accept that favor so that it wouldn't overly kind of burden or emotionally connect you with him, make it bigger than it
Because
was, but he
there's
didn't want to make
intimacy there. Like how intimate is
the
that?
intimacy. There's an important
Intimacy.
not recognizing this deep
Ooh,
intimacy that just happened between
ooh,
the two of you. And
yes.
then you get all the way to the top of the stairs and your arms are shaking and you're sweating and you're trying to look away and trying to act like you're going to comment on something else in the room. You don't care about anything else in the room. It's
No.
important to not catch your breath too aggressively. It's important for
Yes.
him not to lean into you too much.
Yes.
And these are just more of the things that make me think, my God, we are all so terrified.
Yes.
And there was no unhealthy masculinity between the two of you, but the messages you had both been given were driving that situation. Because if it had gone differently, he could have been like, you're someone I can trust because you are the camp counselor for my 5-year-old little brother. And you could be like, you're someone I trust because I don't know, you're here. It's the same house I'm going into anyway, dude. You're going to let me in so I can get the medicine for your little brother. And he could have been like, this sucks. Can you carry me up there? And you'd be like, yeah, it's fine. But you know what?
100%.
Your ass is heavy. And then you would have carried him more comfortably over your shoulder. And he'd be like, all
100%.
right, but I'm going to listen, if there's money in your wallet, it's mine. And it would have been funny and no big deal,
Yes.
right? You would have gotten
Uh-huh.
to the top. See, because I'm a dude, so I know what would have happened. And you would have gotten to the top of the stairs and you would have put him down on the bed. And then you would have been like, what? You're not even going to give me a drink, you know? And then he would be like, don't be an asshole. It's in the fridge. Go get whatever you want, right?
Yes.
And it would be no big deal. You'd be like, by the way, you stink. And he'd be like, you don't smell so good either. And it wouldn't have had to be so painful. And it would have been
Yeah.
less stress on your muscles, less stress on your back, right?
Yeah.
But you wanted to cry and you couldn't let him see it.
Yeah.
But what that story gives me is how ever present the expectations of toxic masculinity are for boys in the world because it was just the two of you and nobody else was watching. I don't want my son to feel that way.
Yeah,
Is he doomed?
he's not doomed. He's not. I'll tell you why he's not doomed, and this is something that I remind myself of a lot, that many people older than me, wiser than me, who've parented for many more years than I have, remind me of. And I do believe this. I think so much of being a parent and a model and a support system for our kids, it's more about what we get right than what we get wrong. Like I'm getting stuff wrong all the time and trying to grow and be better.
Sure,
But
sure.
I think, I mean, it's not like my mom, I remember like said to me when I was a kid, she said, "You are so deeply loved and you are so deeply wanted." There are so many kids who are brought reluctantly into the world
Yeah, yeah.
that quite literally are not wanted. But I'm saying, like, for you to say, you know, I love you and I choose you and I'm going to be here. Um, I mean, I think that that's one of the most powerful things you can say. And I don't think a child is doomed. So really quickly, I'm going to offer you one piece of evidence in support of what I just said.
Okay.
Maybe the only person growing up that told me that my sensitivity and emotionality was a superpower was my extremely sensitive and emotional mom. And her against the world kept alive the well of emotionality that's made possible everything I do now as a father, artist, speaker, and writer.
Now you're going to
The
make me
only
cry.
the only person. So never doubt that you, as the mom to your boy, by yourself are not enough to counteract everything else.
It's messed up because my plan was to make you cry. And now what you did is that's just messed up. That is not how this podcast goes, mister. That's not, we didn't, no, you just violated some sort of a contract. So I may be overthinking some of this, but thank you for the conversation because, raising good boys is very, very important
Yes,
and we're all doing our best.
yes, yes, Poonam. What a joy to have this conversation with you. What great questions. I do so many interviews. This is like some of the best questions I can remember getting, to be honest with you. So yeah,
Really?
really, really thoughtful, really great
Yeah.
questions.
I'm getting that feedback from a lot of people and it just makes me think, why is the bar so low?